G'day everyone, Mark here from Mark and Cars. Thanks for watching the channel today. Today I'm planning on doing a video on the history of the Air Cooled 911. Got one of each of the series of cars here, as you can see. Let's go through them one by one. Before we have a look at each of the body evolutions of the Air Cooled 911, let's start with the creation of the 911. The car was originally displayed at the 1963 Frankfurt Motor Show as the Porsche 901. Production started in September 1964 as a slightly shorter wheelbase to the F-Series car I have here. The car was designed by Butzi Porsche, Ferry Porsche's son, and he was assisted by Erwin Commenda, the original designer of the 356, the car the 911 was designed to replace. The new car was powered by a 2-litre Boxer 6-cylinder motor that put out about 130 horsepower, and whilst the new car was heavier, it was still a very sporty and dynamic drive. So the long hood cars, or what are affectionately known as the F-Series cars, this is really a very good example. This particular example is a 1973. It has the 2.4 litre engine. It's a 911T, tangerine orange, great colour, I'm sure you'll agree. They're called long hood cars because the bonnet itself comes right down to the bumper, which you'll see is unique in this body design compared to the models that follow. And this is actually a factory colour that the car was available in. This particular example is at the very end of the long hood body style. So the F-Series cars, or the A through to F-Series cars, they were in production from September 1964 through to 1973. The first 901 body shape actually had quite a short lifespan, from 1964 through to 1966. It was shortly replaced with a slightly longer wheelbase car, which internally is referred to as the A-type or A-series cars, and evolved throughout this chassis design to 1973, finally in the F-Series car. Throughout this period of production, the car had a few refinements and evolutions. It started out as a carburetted 6-cylinder 2-litre motor. 1968 saw the introduction of fuel injection as an option on a couple of the models in the 911S and the 911E. 1969 saw an expansion of the car's engine capacity to 2.2 litre, and 1971 saw the introduction of the 2.4 litre motor with more torque and also a new gearbox, the 915 gearbox. It actually has a traditional H pattern, unlike the original 901, which had a dogleg first. For 1 year only in this period, there was also an external oil filler, which was very convenient for knowledgeable owners, but not so great when service station attendants, which were very common at the time, put fuel in the wrong side of the car. The end of this chassis style came in 1973 and was completed with the introduction of the Carrera RS, which was essentially a factory race car available to customers. Lightweight, high performance, but we won't go into the performance models of the 911s in this video. 1973 saw the introduction of what's known as the G-type bodies, or G-series bodies, very recognisable by the impact bumpers that are on the car and a shorter hood. And this particular style of body, the G-type, had the longest production life cycle of any of the body types of the Air Cooled 911s. Started in 1973 and went through to 1989. 1973 through to 1976 saw a displacement increase from the previous model to 2.7 litre, and also during this period the introduction of the 930 or the turbo cars, but we'll stay focused on the naturally aspirated cars for this particular video. 1976 had a increase in capacity to 3 litre. The car was called a Carrera 3.0. It had essentially the same motor as the turbo, but without the turbo and slightly higher compression ratio, and had wider rear flares for larger, wider Fuchs wheels. Probably the highest production model of Air Cooled 911s is known as the 911SC, which was introduced in 1978 through to 1983. It's actually called a 911SC, not a Carrera SC, purely because the SC stands for Super Carrera. And it was during this time that it was originally anticipated that the incoming 928 was going to replace the 911. we all know that didn't eventuate, and the 911 continues through to production today, unlike the 928. 1984 saw a completely new car introduced called the Carrera 3.2. 3.2 designation is again for the increase in capacity, and 80% of the components, including the suspension and a lot of the interior features, were new. 1984 also saw the introduction of what is known as the M491 option, which is essentially the turbo body on a normally aspirated car. So this means that you could have the turbo look with the wide guards, big wheels, big whale tail, without the expense of the turbo model. 1987 saw an introduction of the G50 gearbox, which, whilst physically larger, could handle the increased torque and power that the 911 had been receiving up to date and was clearly going to be receiving further on from here. The G-Type car continued from Carrera 3.2 right through to the end of the G-Type cars in 1989. 1989 saw the introduction of the 964. This car really was a revolution as much as an evolution of the 911. There's quite a lot of things changed during the 964 chassis. It is completely new chassis, had coil springs to replace the torsion bar suspension that the car is known for. We had the introduction of ABS, anti-locking brake system, hydraulic power steering. To keep the car looking aesthetically quite pleasing, the rear spoiler was actually deployed at speed. The car looked aesthetically very nice. It had much larger bumpers, which were quite polarising amongst 911 enthusiasts, and the engine capacity increased out to 3.6 litre. It was by far the most developed and powerful 911 to date. There was also the introduction of a model called a Carrera 4. This was a four-wheel drive option available in the 964 chassis. 1990 saw the introduction of the Tiptronic gearbox, which was the most manualised automatic pretty much available on the market, although the Tiptronic is deemed less desirable in the market today compared to the manual cars. However, in the day it was considered an absolute delight to drive and allowed drivers to achieve faster acceleration times and, in a lot of cases, better track times for less experienced drivers. 1991 saw the introduction of dual airbags in a production car, second car only in the world to have it, the first being the 944, another Porsche model. Production continued and evolved in the 964 through to 1994. So whilst the 964 chassis only had a short lifespan of 5 years, quite a large number of them were made because the car was deemed to really evolve from an enthusiast sports car through to a mainstream GT car, and the media absolutely adored this car. With the incoming expectation of pollution control, there was a new car on the horizon, and Porsche was expected that they were going to have to leave the air-cooled era behind and consider developing water-cooled cars. Before the introduction of the water-cooled cars, Porsche had one more air-cooled chassis range up its sleeve, and that's the 993. Its production cycle was from 1994 through to 1998, and for nearly every Porsche enthusiast is the pinnacle of the air-cooled cars. More aerodynamic, had a new rear multi-link suspension system, which resulted in less oversteer from lift-off and mid-corner, so it was a much safer car to drive at speed, and it made drivers feel much more confident to drive the car aggressively. There was a new four-wheel drive system introduced in 1996, along with the new Vario Ram engine. The Vario Ram engine was a development of the intake runners, which changed their length to suit the revs that the motor was doing at any moment in time. So it basically allowed you to have high power and high torque at both high and low RPM, making the Vario Ram engine the most desirable of all the air-cooled engines in the 911 lifespan. For a lot of the purists, 1998 was a sad year with the end of the air-cooled cars and the introduction of the 996 water-cooled cars. Well, I hope you've enjoyed a bit of information about the air-cooled 911s there. You can see all the cars are presented beautifully, and if you've got any comments about my history of the cars, that type of thing, please don't hesitate, put them below. I'll put all the videos I've mentioned and discussed in the description below, so please have a look at those. Browse the channel if you haven't already, and think about subscribing. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks for watching. Mark and Cars.